Hello, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and this week joining me is Nora Gedgaudas. Nora is an author of Primal Body, Primal Mind, and most recently, Primal Fat Burner. And she is a hoot. She is an amazing woman with an amazing story about how she got onto a ketogenic diet. She is a wealth of knowledge and one of the people that I turn to most when I want to know anything about nutrients, how much I should be getting, where I should be getting them from, and we cover all of that and more in this episode. So get out your notebook and take some notes. This is going to be a good one. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and best information about the ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Nora, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Oh, thank you, Anthony. It's a real honor to be here.
You're one of the main people that I go to whenever I need to look up something and I think, okay, who has actually done the work and just figured this out and actually researched it and didn't just read a blog post and read another blog post. Like that just seems very rare. So I appreciate that. Good work on that.
I appreciate your acknowledgement of that. And I agree with you. You know, I'm not just an armchair researcher either. I have had more than 20 years of clinical experience, kind of, to apply to some of what I've written too. So, I take a great deal of pride in the amount of research and effort that I put into what it is I write.
It is much appreciated. And the second reason is that, and I didn't know this until I read your most recent book, was that you grew up in Minnesota as well. So did I.
No kidding.
Yeah. So
where'd you grow up?
In St. Cloud, so central Minnesota.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And that actually was a pretty fascinating story in your most recent book, Primal Fat Burner. So maybe it would be a good point to just start there and chat about kind of how you were raised and like everything that you learned and what got you in your path to begin with.
Right. So, my interest in nutritional science goes back, 35 years plus. But for the better part of my, formative years in that regard, I was really focused on supplementation. That's what kind of interested me because I found that I could take certain things and it would help me feel different, feel better in certain ways. And that really intrigued me. But I didn't necessarily have a central cohesive kind of foundational dietary kind of philosophy behind all of that. It was just more what supplement does what, which is a lot of what gets taught in natural health, colleges and things like that. Is that so-called evidence-based nutrition, but that isn't really diet, And then I was sort of bought into the more mainstream narrative about that at the time. I was also a little more naive in those days. And so I bought into sort of the low fat, higher carb, type of approaches. And then in 1991, I was invited to travel to the high Arctic. I was with a wolf biologist. That's, kind of a long story unto itself, but I have some background in wildlife science, and I was very good friends with this wolf biologist, and he invited me to spend a summer doing some observational, behavioral research of this sort of very rare subspecies of Arctic wolf. And so we spent a whole summer living less than 500 miles from the North Pole with a family of these wild wolves.
And so if the people who haven't grown up in Minnesota, it probably isn't that much different. I guess you be the judge on that, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, where we were up there, it was a bit of a thermal oasis. And in the summertime, the temps were, hovered around freezing a good part of the time, but we had, 60-degree temps a couple of days. I actually got into a pair of shorts and a tank top to get some pictures those days. And of course, then quickly got dressed after the pictures were taken. But the high Arctic, it's 24-hour daylight in the summer and kind of lovely. But when winter kicks in, it does that with a vengeance. And it's the temps are brutal and unforgiving, and the darkness goes on and on and on for about 6 months.
What did you notice changes to your sleep patterns when that happened? And how long were you up there for?
I was up there for about 3 months, for a whole summer.
Was it difficult to sleep? Did you need like room darkening shades?
I used a sleep mask.
Okay.
When I really wanted to sleep, I did what I could to block out the light. It was interesting though. My female cycle kind of ramped up a bit, and I had a couple of cycles within a month, kind of a thing, that might have been related to some of the light confusing things. But yeah, it was really interesting, because I would look at my watch and I would see 3 o'clock, and 3 o'clock, and I think, is it 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon? And it was sometimes hard to tell. So yeah.
And so is this where you started really figuring out that the whole low fat, high carb paradigm was wrong, and what happened there?
Well, on the way up there, we passed through an Inuit community called Resolute Bay, which was on an island that was still south of Ellesmere, but we had to kind of, gather ourselves together, get some extra outfitting supplies. And it was, an Inuit community of about 200 people. And there was a store that was, I don't know, probably about the size of my bedroom at home, which isn't big. I mean, it would, there were a few limp vegetables and some processed stuff in there. But for the most part, even though people liked the taste of those foods, they weren't practical. They were expensive, and it was much more a logical thing for them to mostly rely upon subsistence, hunting and fishing and that sort of a thing. So that's what they did. But, they weren't growing vegetables. They weren't eating tofu. They weren't doing anything like that. They were mostly eating extremely high fat, meats and fish, and not a whole lot of plant foods of any kind. And I didn't see any obesity there. Now, my understanding is that things are changing rapidly up there, and I suspect I would be very disappointed to see what was there if I went back. But at the time, it was still pretty good. People looked good, and that niggled at me. I just kind of I didn't know where to put that in my psyche, because it was in conflict with the narrative that I had sort of bought into. And then we got to Ellesmere, and the strange thing happened to me after a few days. I found myself kind of craving very fatty foods, and I'm sitting on my backside, not moving very much for the better part of the summer, and noshing on, salami and cheese and nuts and nut butters. And then, once a week or so, we would make a pilgrimage to a military weather station that was, some distance away. It was a bit of a road trip to get there. We used four-wheelers to get there. And so we could take showers. What a concept. And maybe make a 15-minute phone call home to assure people I hadn't been, eaten by a polar bear. And then the officer in charge let me go into the mess hall and indulge in whatever might happen to be laying out. And we always went at like 3 a.m. so that we weren't disrupting, the daily activities there. So everybody was pretty much asleep, and we had the place to ourselves. And I walked into that mess hall, and, with the light of heaven shining upon it was this enormous bowl of butter. And I became obsessed with that bowl of butter, and I, would go rushing over to it. And, oh, hey, a loaf of bread, a vehicle for the butter. I was still eating that crap in those days. And just, making toast and just slathering the butter on and eating slice after slice until I was too embarrassed to continue. And then, heading, back out to the tundra again. And, I do understand that there's such a thing as a, thermogenic effect. And I even understood that back then. But it was pretty interesting to me that by the end of that summer, of doing not much more than sitting on my butt the whole time, because the wolves didn't like it when we walked around. They were okay when we used the four-wheelers to follow them on their hunts and things, but they really didn't like us walking around the den and whatever. We had to sit very quietly and respectfully, and they'd walk right up to us and tug at our bootlaces and stuff. But otherwise, we kind of had to stay still. So not a lot of opportunity to, work out, exercise, all that kind of a thing. And I was mostly, eating, and we did some hunting, but, fatty foods. And by the end of the summer, I'd lost about 25 pounds. And I thought, WTF was that? People wondered, my God, did you do this on purpose? It's like, well, no, actually, I just sat on my butt and I ate fat all summer, and this is what happened to me.
What caused the increased cravings of fat? You mentioned that when you were up there, you started snacking on those things. Was it just the availability of that, and then you started just being more accustomed to it, or was it the lifestyle of being up there?
I expected to really miss vegetables. At the time I went up there, I had been doing a lot of juicing and eating a lot of salads and, lots of vegetable this and that. I mean, I still do a lot of fibrous vegetables and greens, but I really expected to miss that. And I didn't. That was a big surprise.
So it was more of a diet of availability, and you kind of accidentally went into maybe a state of fat burning or ketosis.
It may have had something to do with, having to generate more body heat, that thermogenic effect. There's no question that played into some of it. But at the same time, it still was a real conflict with what should have happened had I, if one is to buy into that, fat makes you fat, and not exercising, makes you fat, and all of that kind of thing. It was something that was a real wake up call in a way. Actually, the real wake up call came, it niggled at me, right? I'm trying to figure out where to put this. And I got home, and it was not long after I got back that I got introduced to the work of Weston A. Price. And I'm sure, you're very familiar with him. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are too. And it was like being gobsmacked in the forehead with, sack of wet cement. It's like, of course, right. This is really in alignment with how my ancestors evolved. But I didn't think Price went back far enough. And that's, also why I chose the term primal. Primal to me suggests something that's older, more foundational, more truly prehistoric than paleo, which has come to mean almost anything somebody wants to, attach to it. I mean, it's really, the definition is all over the place now. It means something different to everybody claiming to practice it. And I don't pretend that the word primal means the same to everybody else using that term out there. But that's what it means to me.
And so how did you define that? And so you went from studying wolves in the Arctic, and then where was your path after that? It seems like a very sharp turn.
Yeah, well, it was a very convoluted path for me to get to where I am now. I mean, extremely convoluted. But I knew I was onto something with that. And I began researching these concepts, these ancestral concepts in earnest. And one thing led to another, and suddenly I had more of a foundational framework on which to base my passion for nutrition, and it really radically transformed my health. And the more I kind of lost the carbs, so to speak, the utilizable carbs like sugars and starches and things like that, and stuck with foods that were really in alignment with my human evolutionary and genetic heritage, really the better my health got. And, over time, that's been refined over time. And that type of, anytime you adopt a new dietary approach, it's a process, right? You're never 100% there from the get-go. Although I do my best to introduce an optimized approach to people who read my material from the get-go, but it's taken me a long, long time to get to where I am. I wish I had known what I know now when I was in my 20s, right? That would have been awesome.
Right. So you obviously noticed a lot of effortless fat loss when you were up in the Arctic, but what were some of the other things you said you noticed that you were having different health changes?
What
were some of those things that kind of popped at you first, and you're like, wow, this is not how I should have been feeling?
Right. Well, one of the things that sparked my interest in nutritional science from the get-go was a deep, intractable, protracted, more than 35 years worth of depression. and also anxiety and panic attacks that really weren't responding to any of the conventional approaches. And so, when I was like 13 and seeking help, anything related to depression was considered a psychological issue, right? So you go and you talk to a therapist or counselor about your problems, and hopefully they help you resolve those problems, and then you feel better. And would never mean to demean or diminish the value of that work. I think it's been some of the most important work I've ever done, but it really couldn't touch the physiological component that was depression for me. And then from there, there was this whole new paradigm shift right around the time Prozac came out on the market. And suddenly now it's like, oh, yes, if you're depressed, it's not because you had bad toilet training or were smacked around as a kid. No. It's a biochemical imbalance. And all you need to do is take this little magic pill. Right. And voila, in no time at all, all that will be corrected and you'll feel better. And we know from the Freedom of Information Act now, and just simply from more current science on the subject, that the studies that were used to approve SSRIs as the gold standard in treating depression showed them only to be slightly more effective than placebo, maybe 13% effective, and of that 13%, 40-50% of people had either a plateauing or effect or a falling off of effectiveness after a while. And it ultimately it really wasn't the solution. Depression really isn't a neurotransmitter deficiency, but that's, of course, where the pharmacologic model sort of still lies, where the money, in other words, still lies. But the understanding of what actually causes that has changed quite a bit among those actually doing legitimate research on the subject, independent research. But I digress.
Was there a point when you realized, like, oh hell, I'm not depressed anymore? I feel happier. Because it's such a gradual thing. It's such a gray spectrum that people. It's hard to realize when you're slipping into that and going down that path, and it's kind of like you look back after a few months for a lot of people, and they realize, wow, things have really changed. Did you have like a singular moment that you remember where you connected the dots between the improvement in your mood and your nutrition?
Yeah, well, so it was a twofold thing that happened. I made a discovery of a particular brain technology. I was interested in the field of neurotechnology, and I've been, into that since the early 1990s. But something called neurofeedback had a very immediate effect on shifting that pattern for me. However, one of the other things that was happening at almost the exact same time is that I was really taking some more advanced strides in adopting this more ancestral way of eating and kind of losing the carbs and losing the gluten and, all that stuff, which I believe was the reason that I was able to get optimal and lasting effects from that particular intervention. But, I was impressed enough with the effects I got from neurofeedback to become a neurofeedback clinician, for more than 20 years. And but I also recognize that, you can be doing the best, therapeutic modality in the world. But, something like neurofeedback, I can be doing the best possible, protocol for a person's particular issues. But it's not going to put a nutrient there that's not there. And It's certainly not going to take away some interfering substance that is, that doesn't belong. So the brain and the body need certain raw materials in order to function. And they need to be able to do that without interference from substances that are more likely to compromise and support your health. So,
and I think that we can hammer on this all day long. And one thing I don't understand is that people seem to not make the connection that you are like a physical being, and everything that you're made of is from the things that you eat.
Right.
And so, like, not wanting to eat high quality things is baffling to me. Like, every cell that you're made of is from something that you've eaten.
Well, exactly. All of it is dependent on that. And in conventional medicine has us, believe that the raw materials used to build the human organism don't matter.
Right.
And, it's almost like saying, okay, let's build an airplane out of rusty bolts and scrap metal and duct tape and, whatever else, and it'll be just as good as any other kind of airplane, and expect that to fly well. I mean, no place else, in the world, does that kind of attitude apply, other than it seems, kind of mainstream, the attitude in mainstream medicine. It's sort of crazy, and it really does. The other thing I find overwhelmingly is that frequently people don't make the connection between physical health and mental health. Right.
And one of the things I want to touch on before, because I want to talk about a little bit more about nutrient density and how you actually get that in your nutrition. But can you give just a brief sidebar on what neurofeedback is? Obviously, it's something you spent a lot of your time doing, and it was very impactful for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So neurofeedback is a very sophisticated and highly specific form of brain training. And it's been around, certainly since about the 70s, although it really didn't start entering the clinical realms until sometime in the 80s. It was in laboratories before that. UCLA was doing a lot of research with it. But it's basically a process by which you give your brain information about its own functioning so that it is better able to manage its own states, effectively. And it's, there are electrode sensors that are applied to the scalp in whatever configuration that is appropriate to what a person happens to be reporting about their symptoms, issues, or goals. And that those electrode sensors then go into an amplifier that amplify that electrical signal coming out of your head. And then that is displayed on a therapist's screen. And so you see the EEG happily scrolling along. And then the therapist basically selects a particular protocol, maybe a particular frequency range that, we're going to ask that part of the brain to hang out in for a while. And it's not just one particular, there is a certain amount of localization that occurs with different functions in the brain. It's not a hard and fast rule, but there are some generalizations that really are meaningful. But it's also about improving the communication between different areas of the brain that may not be connecting right, that may not be communicating well. And that can make just a mammoth difference in the way a person feels and functions. And so then once I set the goals for a person, that ends up translating to the software, goes through the software. And there's something that may look a little like a video game, or it may be some kind of animated thing, or literally some kind of like a movie or something. But everything that person is seeing is being attenuated by their brain function in a way that it's not under their conscious control. The feedback is happening extremely, extremely rapidly, way faster. I mean, just a fraction of an instant, within a fraction of an instant, way faster than anyone can consciously process. So the conscious mind is not necessarily privy to this process. The brain will get up to, 2,000-3,000, little bits of information, if you will, in the course of a session. And that ends up translating to a shift in the way that person feels and functions. And then we track those shifts. And based on what kinds of shifts have happened, what we got from that session, what's left over, I'll make adjustments the next time they come in to further improve those results. And you may feel extremely different after session number 1, or it may take up to 10 sessions to start to recognize what this is going to do for you. But ultimately, it takes, the ultimate effect of the training. It's like nothing is really being done to you per se. There's a skill building model and an exercise model involved. The brain is learning how to recognize and manage its own states more effectively. Right. And so all kinds of analogies I could get into to explain it further, but, hopefully that covers it in a basic enough fashion. Yeah. But it's really powerful. Anything under the governance of the central nervous system can stand to be powerfully impacted by this process. But I found that a combination of this particular form of brain training and some of the nutritional concepts that I write about were practically foolproof in their effects on people and, long-term effects on their lives.
Yeah, and you did a really good job at explaining a lot of this stuff. I think that if people who have never heard of anything like this before are listening, and I was at this place before as well when I was younger, very skeptical when they hear about something like this. It just doesn't jive with what we have known about anything on treatment before, and as far as like mental status, and people just don't understand how the brain works on a very fundamental level. They think, oh, that's bullshit. There's no way that stuff could happen like that. Until I started digging into the research, until I started using a lot of things like meditation and thinking about, okay, why and how does this work? And correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of why meditation is so powerful is because you're doing a lot of the same type of thing. You may not have the immediate feedback loop, which is what makes neurofeedback a little bit more powerful, but it works on somewhat of a similar level. Actually,
it's not similar.
Oh,
it really isn't. Meditation is absolutely valid, and I meditate a good hour a day. I'm a passionate proponent of that, but it's not quite the same. The feedback component in neurofeedback is part of what's critical, and a lot of what you're training for is awake state. I mean, there is something called alpha theta training, which is more about getting in and helping people integrate deep-seated, maybe repressed issues or PTSD and addiction and things like that. But a lot of what we do is awake state training, help a person feel and function better, focus better, in a very specific way. Okay. I mean, neurofeedback is very, very specific. Meditation is more of a generalized place of helping the brain find its kind of center, so to speak.
Right. So I guess to be more clear, they both work on a level of modulating the brain's activity in very different ways.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, I used to work with everything from anxiety, depression, autism, ADD, bipolar issues, seizure disorders, weird neurological problems that weren't even necessarily identified by neurologists, and and on and on and on. So a lot of those things, I mean, depression really can't get at a lot of those things very well.
And so you did 20 years of this work. Did you always pair it with nutrition, like how you experience a benefit from it?
Quite often, very often people came in when I first started, my career, people weren't as familiar with me as having that other area of expertise. Once Primal Body, Primal Mind came out, I had people seeking me out who really wanted that combination, or maybe they just wanted the nutritional therapy. So it varied some. But what's cool about neurofeedback is that you're seeing people twice a week, sometimes for 6 months. I mean, it can take 40 sessions for this to become a permanent part of your nervous system. So in the meantime, there was a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to get to know my clients as they came in. And I talked to them a couple hours a week. And they came to understand that I was truly there for their best interests and that I really knew what I was talking about. And they became increasingly interested, especially as they started to feel a little more robust with the training. They became more open to looking at the dietary side of things and making certain changes that frequently just radically accelerated their progress.
Right, which, like we talked about earlier, comes a lot to do with the quality of the food, not just what the food is, but having the quality of food. And one of the things that really, really bugs me, and anyone who follows any of my stuff knows that I get really annoyed with people who think they're on a ketogenic diet and just don't care about nutrition at all. And so they'll post on Instagram stuff like, hashtag keto, it's this fried burger, which with this processed cheese on top and maybe chicken wings cooked in polyunsaturated oils and then a cheese stick wrapped in bacon and fried again, like that this is keto and this is healthy because it raises their blood ketone levels. And so this is something that I know that you are super annoyed with as well, and that you have a lot of evidence as far as why this is a bad idea. And so this is something that I want to cover, is the importance of micronutrition and quality of foods.
Well, the whole point to this, to adopting a ketogenic, way of eating should be anyway, health optimization. And unfortunately, I mean, if I could take out any one word from description of the paleo diet or the ketogenic diet, it's the word because it's become whatever anybody wants to make of it, unfortunately. And which means it's becoming this highly commercialized thing. And once it becomes highly commercialized, it's like an anything goes, and little pictures of cavemen stamped on labels or the word keto on the label. And that makes it something automatically legitimately healthy. I mean, let's face it, a low, a gluten-free, non-GMO, whatever package of brownie mix is still crap,
Right.
And so, people just aren't thinking it through. And I don't know if they're just thinking that weight loss is what they're trying to get out of it, but you can be thin and diabetic, you can be thin and have autoimmunity, you can be thin and have cancer. This isn't just about weight loss, at least from the standpoint that I come from, and I believe that you come from, that it's much more about health optimization.
Right.
And in my mind, first and foremost, this is about, I actually have sort of divested myself a little bit of both the terms paleo and ketogenic, just because there's so much baggage now that comes with those terms that I find myself trying to fit myself like a square peg into a round hole with it. So I've coined my own term now that I've trademarked called primalgenic to try to describe, not as a gimmick, but as a way of setting apart what my message is from everybody else's, because I can define it and it's never going to mean anything other than the meaning I give it. And first and foremost, it's really about a diet focused on foods of uncompromising dietary quality that is in alignment with our human evolutionary and genetic heritage. In other words, 100% organic, 100% grass-fed and finished, free of GMOs, pesticides, herbicides, and all that crap. And also minimizing all foods containing, significant amounts of sugars and starches, including things like, excessive consumption of fruits and fruit juices and so-called natural sugars like honey and coconut sugar and maple syrup and, God forbid, agave and starchy vegetables, as well as all the refined forms of carbohydrates. Now, this is my own take on it, right? And I also include the consumption of only moderate amounts of protein that are sufficient to meet but not exceed a person's basic daily physiological requirements, for their own maintenance and rebuilding and regeneration of tissues. In other words, what I advocate is actually not a particularly high protein, high meat diet, but I do believe it's incredibly important that the protein we consume mainly come from animal source foods. And I know there's a related aspect to that subject that you want to get into, and we will. But I'm also advocating that there's a high percent of dietary fat in terms of the overall caloric intake, where both animal fats, including essential fatty acids and other beneficial fat-soluble nutrients like CLA and fat, like vitamin A, true vitamin A, retinol, vitamin K2, vitamin D3, are really dominating, right? And also, welcome in the dietary approach I advocate are some of the more traditional fats, more plant-based fats like organic olive, avocado, macadamia nut oil, coconut oils, maybe a little sesame oil for flavoring here and there, and, naturally occurring fats that are going to be associated with quality nose to tail meats and organs. Again, all of uncompromising quality.
Right.
And
this is a really good point. So you touched on a lot of stuff there that would be like very, very detail oriented if we wanted to unpack it all. But I think that a lot of people probably listening to this show would say, like, okay, I'm not eating the coconut sugar, the agave. We don't need to go into why those things are particularly harmful as well. But one of the things that I think that people don't realize is the damaging effects of fats, like you said, from appropriate real food sources. When people when they go out to eat and they maybe get something that they think is ketogenic friendly but cooked in a lot of vegetable oil, can we just unpack that and chat about the quality of fats and why that's so important?
Well, right. So, 97% of the meat produced for human consumption is produced in CAFO operations, right? Feedlots. And animals that are shot full of hormones and antibiotics and God knows what the heck else, fed GMO foods and, chock full of glyphosate and just horrific, treatment and stress hormones and, whatever else that these poor animals have to endure. And, setting the ethical issues, the obvious ethical issues aside, in my mind, it really doesn't qualify as nourishing food that comes from that type of meat production. And that, we all really kind of need to stand up and and demand something different. And that something different is 100% grass feeding, feeding those animals what's natural for them to eat.
Right.
If we're trying to eat what's natural for us to eat, we also need to pay attention to whether what we're consuming was fed something that was natural to it. So, and the fatty acid profile of meats that are raised in a way that is natural for that animal and healthy for that animal is so different that it's almost unrecognizable from the fatty acid and nutrient profile of feedlot raised meat.
Right. So if people want to realize this fact that, okay, if feeding a cow, for example, and stressing a cow out and having a cow have a very low quality of life and feeding them grains makes their bodies and what we eat of very, very low quality and unrecognizable to what a cow should be eating, what the hell do you think is happening to your body when you're eating what you should not be eating? The same thing.
Right. That kind of meat deserves a bad rap, and I can put it in a really simple sentence, that the health of the meat and the fat that you consume really depends on the health of the meat or the health of the animal, I should say, that meat came from.
Right.
And that fat came from. And not quite as concise as I planned to say it, but you get the idea. And so that's just common sense. I mean, you don't have to throw a bunch of peer-reviewed references at that. That's logical, to see things that way. And unfortunately, most of our food is being produced and processed in such an unnatural manner that, I mean, even if you're shopping in, the highest end, best, kind of naturally oriented food stores, you've got to be hyper vigilant to be able to get something that isn't going to be compromising on some level. It's really tough because the organic standards are eroding, and even some of what they call grass fed, kind of isn't in a fully legitimate way. So it takes really becoming more conscious of all of this and learning to ask questions, and also learning to respectfully demand what it is you want and what it is you're not willing to put up with. And when I go into a grocery store and I see them, them putting canola oil and everything in the deli section, or there was a new store that opened up, and I walked to the meat section and I said, do you have any fully grass-fed and finished meat here? Well, no, but we have the best quality grain, blah, blah, and that's organic over there. And I said, I just want you to know, I know you feel you're doing the best you can, but I also want you to know that I won't be shopping here,
Right.
And this is why, and I also won't be recommending this place, and this is why. But conversely, I'm not just a curmudgeon. I will also go into stores, and if I see them doing the right thing, not only will I just sort of make a point of shopping there and buying that product, I will find somebody and I will say, who's in a position of some authority. And I will say, it is awesome that you are carrying this. I just want you to know that I really appreciate you doing this. And this is exactly what I'm looking for. And not only will I be shopping here from now on for this, but I will also be telling everybody I know to shop here because you're carrying this. And the thing is, grocery stores operate on a shoestring budget. They have very narrow profit margins. And so they are likely to listen. And we need to be vocal.
And so one of the things that you said too, like, it can be very confusing selecting even meat. So grass-fed does not mean grass-finished. And so what happens is they can raise a lot of cattle on grass,
Yes.
and then fatten
They're
them
all
up with
raised
grain.
on grass for a certain percentage of their lives. And so that's what they get away with sometimes.
And then one of the things that I didn't know much about until recently. So I just moved to Austin and Texas, and I get all of my animal product, most of them from ranches locally. And one of them is what's called Bar 3 Ranch. I'm hoping to get the owner of that on the podcast sometime soon, but he's detailed that the majority of even grass-fed, grass-finished, they raise their cattle and they charge them through unnatural grasses so that they can bring them to processing within 12 months. Well, this is not a real way to raise an animal. Like, this is not an appropriate time frame, that appropriate grasses, and this alters the micronutrient composition of the animal drastically as well.
Right. Well, and this brings me to another aspect to this that is really important to me, and part of my primalgenic definition is that I always have an eye toward optimizing not only human but also planetary health. That the ways in which most food is produced today is entirely unsustainable in the long term. And we need to look at that. We need to start taking that stuff seriously, because the planet is being laid waste to these shortcuts, as a result of these shortcuts, as a result of the short-sightedness that is being, implemented by farmers and ranchers that, they recognize that grass-fed is more in demand and organic is more in demand, and they want in on the gravy.
Right.
So they're looking for all the ways that they can tell us what we want to hear, about what they're selling, and capitalize on that without necessarily doing all the right things. Sure. And we have to be increasingly vigilant about that.
Yeah, and so one of the things that people, let's say they don't eat super high quality, and they say, well, it doesn't matter, I take a multivitamin. And this is one of the things, too, that drives me nuts, that you do a very good job of explaining in your book, that there's so many of these nutrients that come in different forms that we just can't put into a supplemental form, that are also synergistic to each other, that without one, the other one doesn't work. And this is like, there's so much that we just don't know about this field and how micronutrition works. Can you just touch on some of the stuff?
Well, I teach a year-long, 52-week certification, accredited certification course. And one of the modules I teach, which I consider a really important one, is on, supplementation. And it has really been an eye-opener for the people that have taken. I mean, I get more emails on that module with people saying, holy crap, I had no idea. I mean, it's quite a racket. And I am a big fan of quality supplementation at the right time for the right things in the right ways. I'm not into shotgun approaches. I don't personally take a multivitamin. I kind of don't believe in them, frankly. And you're trying to cram, the minimum requirements of everything you need in a day in some tiny little compressed pill that's full of, fillers and additives and binders and coatings and whatever else that may not even break down on the way through. And are largely synthetic, many of which are petroleum. I mean, most B vitamins sold are petroleum based, so these things are really problematic. We're designed to get what we need, micronutrients and macronutrients, from food, real, nourishing, nutrient dense food. And the problem in part too is that it's not just, we understand some things about individual nutrients, but there's also a lot that we don't understand about the synergistic interactions between them. It's kind of like the difference between allopathic and maybe functional medicine in some ways, or at least by definition, whereby in allopathic medicine, which still operates by a largely Newtonian model of everything is compartmentalized from everything else, and everything is studied in isolation from anything else, as if that were any representation of reality at all. Well, functional medicine, at least in theory, acknowledges that there is a highly complex interconnectedness and interactiveness between the different areas of the body, and certainly between different nutrients in the body, and that there are many substances within food that have yet to be identified or understood in terms of the role that they play, not just on their own, but in synergy with other nutrients. And in nature, nutrients don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in concert with other nutrients and are designed to work together. Everybody's like slathering, or not slathering, but like chugging vitamin D supplements, like they're going out of style, and not understanding that without vitamin K2, I mean real vitamin K2, MK4, which is what we evolved consuming, which only comes from animal fats, or vitamin. True vitamin A, which is retinol, which only comes from animal source foods. And by the way, vitamin A is not beta carotene.
Right.
Don't get started on that.
The other day, I actually posted this infographic on my Instagram, showing like the nutrient composition compared to like carrots and then beef and then other vegetables and liver. And the vitamin A was obviously very high in animal products and non-existent in the carrots. And somebody said, well, this is just wrong. I can't trust you because vitamin A has a super high, or vitamin A is super high in carrots.
Right. And it's not the same.
No, actually, there are precursors to it.
It takes anywhere from 6 to 20 units of beta carotene to form a single unit of true vitamin A, retinol, which we truly need for the functioning of our immune system, our epithelial tissue, of, I mean, it just goes on and on, what vitamin A is critical for.
Yeah,
In health. And very few people get sufficient vitamin A, and you cannot. If you have any kind of nutrient deficiencies, if you have thyroid issues, whatever, you may, or if you're a young child before, you may not be able to make those conversions at all. And ultimately, it is impossible to truly meet your real vitamin A requirements using beta carotene. But guess what? There's plenty of beta carotene in grass-fed meat.
And
this
is one of those things where it's not just vitamin A. There's so many other things in plants where people try to compare plants to animal sources and say, oh, well, there's plenty of it here, I can just get it here. No, it's not the case. There may
be a lot of zinc in the pumpkin seed, but you're also going to have phytic acid in that pumpkin seed that is going to probably bind that zinc and make it unavailable to you. Now, even if you soak and sprout that pumpkin seed, zinc requires the action of hydrochloric acid in the stomach in order to be properly ionized and absorbed and utilized. Well, it's animal source foods that concentrated complete animal source protein that most effectively stimulates appropriate hydrochloric acid levels that form the signaling mechanism for the rest of what goes on in our digestive process. We human beings have a hydrochloric acid-based digestive system, not a fermentative one that is characteristic of herbivores.
Right.
And people just don't think, they're like, well, look at the cow gets all the zinc or all of the whatever that it needs. Look, the cow, for starters, when you look at the animals that are actually designed to eat a carbohydrate-based diet, right? The herbivores, the ruminants, whatever. What are they doing all day? Their faces are in the bushes, they're in the trees, they're in the grass, whatever, and they are eating more or less constantly in their waking hours in order to meet their most basic nutritional requirements. But what's happening is that fermentative digestive system is going to work on all of that cellulose, which binds a lot of those nutrients. We don't have the ability to really process that cellulose in the way that herbivores do. And the bacteria then in the guts of these animals, these huge vats of bacteria in the guts of these animals, work on these things to not only extract the nutrition from the plants, but also synthesize a lot of the nutrition. And it may interest some of your listeners to know, if they don't already, that at least 70% of all of the calories that a cow extracts from its food actually don't come from carbs and aren't carbs at all.
Whether they're
but actually
fatty acids?
Short chain saturated fatty acids, butyric acid mainly, from the bacterial fermentation of all that fiber. We don't have that capability at all. We just don't. Our guts are the fermentative portion of the human digestive tract makes up only about 20% of the total digestive tract. In a chimp, it's 52%. But even chimps eat some meat. But they're better. You can see they're barrel chested. They have this huge barrel gut. They almost look like they're beer drinkers or something, because they have this big fermentation vat in their gut that we don't have. Our gut has changed quite a lot, and we have this greatly expanded small intestine and a greatly shortened large intestine as part of, what's sort of become the expensive tissue hypothesis. We traded that big fermentative gut for a bigger brain, and I think it was a good trade-off.
Right.
But we need to honor that, in the way that we consume our diets. There's no such thing as a vegetarian or vegan diet being optimally healthy for any living human being. Not in the fossil record, not in our genome, not anywhere in our evolutionary, path.
Yeah, and I think
go ahead.
And another place where we see this too is omega-3 fatty acids. This is another thing where trying to get them in a plant source is, I mean, I think you said in your book, like 0 to 6 or 8% of omega-3s in the plants can actually be usable or assimilated into your own tissues.
Well, no, up to 6% under optimal circumstances of plant-based omega-3 may convert to EPA, and chances are none of that will convert to DHA at all.
Got it. So
even
worse.
So the plant-based omega, it's like, have this flax oil really high in omega-3s. It's a ruse. You're being bamboozled. You're not, the omega-3s that are in flax oil or walnuts or sanchinichi oil or chia oil or whatever are not the kind of omega-3s that the human body needs the most, right? We require these elongated forms of omega-3s, EPA and DHA. And one of the things that allowed us to advance so much as a species, particularly our brains, is that we were able to get those elongated forms of EPA and DHA, those elongated forms of omega-3 from animals that had already synthesized them for us. For us, it's a shortcut. For them, it's a very, very long process, and they're better able to efficiently create those things. But what characterizes, for instance, uniquely characterizes human cognition, other than the fact that we have, triple the brain size of our most closely related primate ancestor, which is the chimpanzee, is that the fatty acids that represent, or not represent, but that characterize human cognition most are these 20 and 22 carbon elongated fatty acids, both arachidonic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, both of which are found exclusively within the food supply in animal source foods. In a chimp, their brains are omega-6 based, primarily. Ours are omega-3 based, which is highly unique in all of the primate kingdom. In fact, all of the animal kingdom. So, it's also unique among humans is that we have an exclusive ability as a species to be able to make full-time use of, our brains have the capacity to make full-time use of ketones as a primary source of fuel, and no other species can claim that.
Right.
And I think this speaks tremendously to the unique structure and function of the human brain versus the brains of other animals. Our brains are much more demanding, and we're literally born into this world in a state of effective ketosis, and ketones are the major fuel for brain development right out of the gate. And children don't start craving the carbs and the sugar and the candy and whatever until we start feeding it to them.
Exactly. And so
we're changing their neurological development in the process.
So I think it's very clear to just say that nutrient quality from real food is essential. Like you cannot skip on it, and you need to eat high quality animal products if you want to assimilate any of the nutrients in a meaningful way. So
That's
as
right.
you start bringing up ketosis, one of the questions that I get asked all the time, multiple times a day actually, is this keto thing is great. I'm feeling all right, but could I really be doing this long term? Like, is this something I have to cycle out of every now and then? And this whole issue about
I love that you're asking that.
metabolic flexibility now, and people just are really afraid of this as a long term solution. What is your point of view here?
Yeah, man, I'm so glad that you asked, because I'm annoyed to heckin' back. I almost said a bad word. With this whole idea of, you've got to be cycling ketosis. I consider that a total myth. I think it is a marketing ploy. I think it's somebody trying to establish a niche within the genre, and it's in part telling people what they want to hear. It's like, I don't have to give up all the carbs. I can enjoy those from time to time. Look, I mean, it takes 6 to 8 weeks to adopt an effective state of ketogenic adaptation for starters. And then, beyond that, beyond that, it's if you're going to be cycling out of that, you're losing that efficiency. You're losing that efficient adaptation to that, I mean, look, the benefits associated with a full-time ketosis is, complete stable. Well, for starters, a 39% increase in cerebral circulation, that comes with that naturally in normal humans. You're getting an enormously stabilizing and reliable fuel, even in the absence of regular meals, that can keep you alert. It's enormously anti-inflammatory. It dampens free radical activity, of course, which is responsible for damaging your tissues. It helps to protect your brain from hypoxia. It improves your overall brain function, cognition, memory. It's non-damaging. Ketones, unlike sugars, don't gum up and damage your tissues. It spares your lean tissue mass. It improves your sleep. It improves your mood. It increases your mitochondrial efficiency enormously. It reduces your blood pressure. It improves your immune function. It gives you healthier skin, on and on and on. It eliminates blood sugar issues, and it lowers hemoglobin, A1C and other metabolic markers that are associated with disease. It improves your thyroid efficiency. It enhances antioxidant activity and glutathione production. It improves your cardiovascular markers. It reduces your cancer risk. It helps you to resist and reverse, diabetes, or significantly improves management. It reduces your risk of Alzheimer's disease enormously.
Sign me up.
It stimulates regeneration repair mechanisms, and as such, it's literally anti-aging in its effect. In addition to helping to normalize weight without hunger deprivation. And but we should only do it cyclically.
Right. And so I think a lot of yes, probably some of it is a marketing strategy, but another thing too is people just tend to be doing it wrong. And so they feel not great on a ketogenic diet because of a few reasons. One, they're not adapted yet. Okay. So like you said, it takes maybe 8 weeks or more. In my experience, it could be taking more than that of somebody who is really metabolically damaged, who has not.
Right, that's true.
Who has had just really awful food in practices and stress and all this stuff their whole life to switch to a ketogenic diet. It takes a long time, up to a couple months. And even for athletes to switch over can take 3, 4, 5, 6 months even to use fat as fuel for athletic performance. And so people might think that, oh, this doesn't work, I need carbohydrates. So that's one of the things. Two, I think, is that people, like we mentioned before, are just not doing ketosis correctly because they're not getting enough micronutrients. And so there's, in some hypotheses here, we say, okay, you may feel fatigued, you may have problems, not due because you're not eating enough food or you're not getting the right fuel, because your body does not have enough micronutrients in what it really needs, the cofactors and the coenzymes, to actually do appropriate things on a cellular level. And then
I totally agree.
And then another thing too, like if you do get into this adaptation phase where you can safely use fat for fuel and your body is burning that, and you're getting a lot of these micronutrients. Well, like you said, people generally like to just use it as a way to eat cheat meals to go back in. Well, I don't think that if somebody says, well, I'm going to be in ketosis, but I'm going to eat plantains this weekend, is it going to ruin everything? Like, no, I don't think that's a bad idea. Like, I don't think if you eat sweet potatoes or get plantains or like eat these whole food sources of carbohydrates, I don't think you should subsist on them. And I think that, like you said,
well, and you have to be able to expect that you might be knocking yourself out of ketosis for a couple of days following that, and your cravings for carbs may go up, and you're going to have to deal with that.
Right. But
some people are actually derailed. Yeah, people can be derailed from these simple forays too on these cheat days and things.
Yeah, but, which is totally doable. But one of the things that I've noticed that going a long time in a ketogenic diet, if I eat some carbs, even in a reasonable amount, it's like a couple of weeks ago I had a ton of sushi. I was celebrating one of my last dinners in San Francisco. I was at one of my favorite restaurants, had a bunch of sushi, white rice, and the next morning I fasted a little bit. In the afternoon I was back in using ketones. So these are the things that, like, after you train your body to start using these fuels and stoking that fire, it's not as bad as a lot of people who go their whole life never using this pathway into then having to upregulate the actual metabolic machinery. Like your cells have a tough time actually using this energy as fuel when you first transition to it. That doesn't just go away if you eat carbohydrates in one afternoon.
No, it doesn't. It's not like it's going to take another 6 to 8 weeks for you to get it back. I do think it generally takes longer than a day to be effectively using ketones again. Not producing them and effectively using them may be two different things, because your body's going to work really hard to focus on burning off the sugar before it goes back to relying on ketones again.
True.
Those are elevated.
But I different strategies too. Like this is where if I do time carbohydrates or use them, I time it around a really hard physical activity. And so this is another way too, where
that's you can smart thing. Yes.
Reduce the overall burden on your body that you're going to be producing with all these carbs.
Absolutely. And I mean, and you can burn off the sugar. You can't burn off the insulin. But if you're going to transgress, so to speak, that yes, I think that's exactly right. You want to maybe do that around some strenuous physical activity, or, just right before your workout or whatever it is, so that you're at least doing something to burn that sugar off as quickly as possible. But I've never seen one piece of literature, with respect to this whole cycling phenomenon, real literature and not popular books or blogs, that ever once suggested that full-time ketosis was in any way harmful, or that carbohydrates in any manner, shape, or form have a scientifically established human dietary requirement, right. Period. And that's one, it's just a myth, I think, that literally makes no rational sense whatsoever. And when claims are made that there is harm in full-time ketosis, you always kind of have to consider, number one, the source of the information, whether they actually have a healthcare background, or if they do, the possible maybe personal, political, or populist agendas that person might have for suggesting this. Are they trying to fabricate a special niche for themselves out of thin air? And number two, whether they're using mice or rat studies to make these determinations, neither creature of which are naturally physiologically designed for eating significant amounts of fat, or have anywhere near the unique capacity of humans to make full-time use of ketones. And, three, you also have to consider the type of ketogenic diet that's being implemented. Is it fasting or starvation? Is it large amounts of, canola oil or other toxic non-nutritional fats? Is it a high-fat diet still containing other sources of sugary and starchy carbs? Is it Atkins, with excessive levels of protein? What's the quality or nutrient density of the food people are consuming? Are GMOs part of the picture? Feedlot meat? Yeah. I mean, there's some... Yeah,
and that's why I love everything that you're doing, is because you actually address all this stuff and just don't say like, oh, well, you eat 85% fat,
no.
And then it's not as simple as that. And this is where we try to educate a lot of people through our channels as well, is that like it's a good starting point there, but in my opinion, always you must start with the habit and behavior change of eating real food first.
Right.
And then switching over into the stuff. And if if that needs to be a graduated approach, then that's fine too. But I know it's like, I didn't get to where I'm at just overnight either. Like, I understand that can be a gradual thing, but I think more importantly, eating high quality real food is the most important thing.
It is. It's got to be foundational to everything. And look, we have precious little wiggle room in terms of what it takes to be optimally healthy in the world that we're living in today, which I would submit is infinitely more hostile than anything our prehistoric ancestors ever had to put up with. And one point I like to make is that we are wired as a species, as a creature that was really wild up until a few thousand years ago. We're wired to see as threatening mainly those things that are tangible to our senses. In other words, a saber-toothed tiger jumps out from behind a bush. That's really a tangible threat, a cantankerous woolly mammoth, an ugly date, I don't know. Or, maybe, a severe storm or volcanic eruption or something like that, right? That's tangible to us. That's something that we know we have to respond to. And we have a reflex for responding to. But the fact of the matter is we're living in these climate-controlled environments today, and we're never more than one or two steps away from grabbing a handful of, what either might be food or maybe a food-like substance we can shove in our faces and call it good. So we don't experience the discomfort of starvation or periodic famine or whatever that our ancestors might have experienced from time to time. And therefore, we feel pretty complacent about our circumstances. Some of us have hot tubs in our backyards and stuff like that. Seems pretty luxurious. But the fact of the matter is that majority of the things threatening our survival today as a species are actually kind of invisible to us. It's the contaminants in the air, water, and food supply. It's GMOs. It's it's EMF, contamination, radiation contamination, all kinds of things that are impinging on us in ways that, because they're not tangible, they're easy to ignore and be complacent about. And so we're pretty compromised. And our genome is pretty substantially compromised from even just a generation ago. As each generation goes by, it's increasingly hard to achieve a state of good health, much less optimal health. And so even though the dietary approach, that we're talking about here and that I know I advocate might seem extreme to some, I'm not the one being extreme. what's extreme is the marketplace and the market forces that are monopolizing and compromising and degrading the quality of our food supply and our soils and everything else. And what it takes to be optimally healthy might seem a little extreme to some people, but the fact of the matter is that 20,000 years ago, a lot of what I'm talking about is what came naturally to everybody. They didn't have to think about it.
Right.
That's the way everybody ate, for the most part. So, these are things we all have to be thinking about and conscious of in order to really get the kind of results we think we want to get from these dietary approaches that we're trying to adopt.
Right, and again, thank you so much for doing all the hard work. I mean, like I mentioned when we started this podcast recording, that you're one of the only people who actually dives in deep in breaks a mental sweat in trying to figure out what's going on here. And I think you've put together, I think you mentioned it earlier, but the program that you put together, which is essentially like everything you've learned doing all of this work, is I think, was it like a year-long program or?
Yeah, and it's not even everything, but it covers a variety of subjects that are of a lot of interest to a lot of people. And I cover these different. If you go to primalrestoration.com,
and we'll link to that too in the show notes.
Yeah, you can kind of see the curriculum, what the different topics are that are covered in fairly significant amount of depth. And there's information there that I dare say you are not likely to find anyplace else. I mean, there's one of the things that I feel good about, that I think is a strength of mine, is that I feel like I'm a pretty unique dot connector. I connect different ideas and things together that maybe, a lot of people might not think to connect. It's just kind of unique strength I have. So it's made me a really, really effective clinician. And, I still do some consultation, but primarily I'm putting my focus now on education, because there's just so much of this stuff that people need to understand, and there aren't a lot of places to find that information. So, I put a lot of blood and sweat into creating this program. It was like having a term paper due every week for over a year. Wow. And, I'm kind of drooling in my lap and making daisy chains now, but I'm really proud of the result because it's really effective. And I would say the majority, or certainly more than half of the people enrolled in the program, are actually healthcare practitioners from all different backgrounds. And it's everybody that's enrolled in the program loves it.
Well, thank you for harnessing your unique ability for good. I really appreciate that. And thanks for being on the show. I think we're over an hour now, so we'll tie up here. Where else can people find you, either locally or online?
Yeah, so my website is primalbody-primalmind.com. My main website, where you find my blog, and and if you sign up for my my mailing list or whatever else, then you get a lot of really useful updates. And I really respect people's information. I don't spam people. I don't pummel you with information. You're not going to be getting emails from me every day or even every week necessarily. I tend to send out emails when I have something important to say, and people are grateful for that. I also I'm going to be teaching a 5-day course on this very topic that we're talking about today at the Omega Institute in June 3rd through 8th in Rhinebeck, New York. And yeah, I'm just trying to think what else. That's I guess the main body of what it is I.
Any social media?
Cover. Yeah, I'm available. I have a fan page on Facebook. My Primal Restoration course has its own private forum that I do actually spend some time on, and I do a lot of live Q&A on there and that kind of thing. But that's not available to the general public. But I have, mainly my fan page. I have a primalbody-primalmind.com or whatever, Primal Body, Primal Mind forum. I occasionally go there. And, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, and all of the kind of the basic social media platforms, I guess. And so look for me there too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nora.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. It's been, it's great to talk to somebody that gets it.
Likewise.
It's very, very refreshing, shall we say. So I really appreciate what you're doing, and it's really an honor to be here.
Chat soon. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.